Today's lecture by Caleb McDaniel, Doom and Dawn, A True Story of Slavery in Civil War Texas, is based on his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Sweet Taste of Liberty, A True Story of Slavery and Restitution in America, published in 2019 by Oxford University Press. Aside from Sweet Taste of Liberty, Dr. McDaniel is Mary Gibbs Jones Professor of Humanities at Rice University, is the author of another award-winning book, The Problem of Democracy in the Age of Slavery, which won the Merle Curdy Prize from the Organization of American Historians, and the James Russard Prize from the Society of Historians of the Early American Republic. In addition, he has written numerous academic articles about the history of slavery, anti-slavery, and emancipation in the 19th century, and his essays have appeared in the New York Times, Smithsonian, The Atlantic, and Time. And Dr. McDaniel contributed an essay, Involuntary Removals, Refugeed Slaves in Confederate Texas, to my edited volume, Lone Star Unionism, Dissent and Resistance, Other Sides of Civil War Texas.
Thank you, Frank. The woman I want to tell you about today only spent a few years of her life in Texas, but they were years that reveal a lot about the history of slavery here and in the United States as a whole. And it's a story that addresses questions that we're still debating today about what enslaved people and their descendants are owed for slavery and its aftermath. The woman's name was Henrietta Wood, and she was born enslaved in Kentucky around 1818 or 1820. She spent most of her life in Kentucky except for a few years of enslaved labor in New Orleans. But around 1848, she began living and working in Cincinnati, Ohio, after being brought there from Kentucky by the woman who legally owned her at the time. It was the first time Wood had ever lived inside a free state, and as the laws of Ohio required, she received official papers that proved she was now free. For the next 5 years, she lived and worked as a free woman in Cincinnati, boarding houses and private homes, and it was a period she would later describe as her sweet taste of liberty. Unfortunately, not long after Wood's new life and freedom began to dawn, it was followed by a sudden and terrible doom. In 1853, Wood was kidnapped, lured back across the Ohio River, and re-enslaved in Kentucky by a man who was actually a deputy sheriff at the time. His name was Zebulon Ward. Now, the kidnapping and enslavement of free black people by men like Ward was not uncommon in the years before the Civil War. The more famous case of Solomon Northup may be familiar to you from the movie 12 Years a Slave. Like Northup, Wood was sold by her captor to slave traders, and at the end of 1855, they took her down the Mississippi River to be sold at the infamous Forks of the Road slave market in Natchez, Mississippi. Her purchaser there, a planter named Gerard Brandon, was one of the 10 largest slaveholders in the South on the eve of the Civil War, and one of the richest cotton planters in one of the wealthiest cotton districts anywhere in the world. Brandon took her to one of several plantations he owned, a place named Brandon Hall, and he put her to work for the first time in her life in the cotton fields of the Deep South. That's where she remained until the middle of 1863, when Brandon made a fateful decision that brought Wood's story here, to Texas. By that time, the Civil War had been raging for 2 years, and on New Year's Day, 1863, Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation declared that Wood and millions of other slaves living in the Confederate States were now forever free. But that proclamation depended on the force of U.S. arms to enforce it, and as Union troops inched closer to Natchez in the summer of 1863, Gerard Brandon decided to flee west to Texas. Gathering together some 300 people that he enslaved, he forced them to march more than 400 miles to Robertson County, Texas, just north of College Station, where he hoped to wait out the war with the people he considered his property. Henrietta Wood was among those forced to make that terrible trek. After the long march across the swamps of Louisiana to the banks of the Brazos River, she later remembered that she arrived broken down and sick from exposure to the elements, forced to use crutches for an entire year. And she remained there in Texas, still enslaved and far beyond the reach of liberating U.S. armies, until almost a year after the Civil War came to an end. Once again, as with her first taste of liberty in Cincinnati, a seeming dawn of freedom, the Emancipation Proclamation, the approach of Union soldiers near Natchez, had been followed for Wood by another doom. Now, Wood's story did not end there, and it didn't end in Texas. But before I tell you the rest of her story, let me pause for a moment to reflect on what her story so far tells us about slavery in Texas and the Civil War here. That history, sadly, is one that has remained all too hidden from generations of Texans, including myself when I was growing up in South Texas and San Antonio. For a good deal of the 20th century, many white Southern historians argued wrongly that slavery was dying out by 1860 in places like Texas, and they falsely claimed that the Confederacy fought not to preserve slavery, but to defend states' rights. These false claims continued to be made in some of the books that I learned from as a young student in Texas, and perhaps in yours as well. And they continue to be made in some circles today, in defiance of evidence that is well known to historians of the period. One such piece of evidence is the fact that Henrietta Wood's forced relocation to Texas was not an isolated case. Thousands of other slaveholders like Brandon tried to refugee enslaved people to the Lone Star State during the Civil War. And while no one knows exactly how many slaves made the forced march to the West, historians estimate that somewhere between 50,000 to 150,000 enslaved people were brought to Texas during the Civil War, nearly doubling the enslaved population in the state. The motivation for this forced movement was simple. On the eve of the Civil War, the 4 million people enslaved in the United States were worth an estimated $3 billion to their legal owners, more than all of the factories, railroads, and banks in the country combined. That was why men like Zebulon Ward saw a profit to be made in kidnapping a free woman like Henrietta Wood and selling her to Natchez. And that was why Texans and other Confederates went to war to defend slave property. And that was why men like Gerard Brandon believed it worthwhile to force hundreds of slaves to Texas to evade emancipation. Far from dying out in Texas, slavery here died hard. How hard can be seen from the fact that it took the arrival of U.S. troops here in Galveston in the summer of 1865 to finally force white Texans to abide by the Emancipation Proclamation. June 19, 1865, the date of an emancipation order by Major General Gordon Granger, is now widely celebrated here in Texas and around the nation as Juneteenth, a holiday that tells a much truer history of the Civil War than the false one that white Texans long cherished. As African Americans like the great historian W.E.B. Du Bois have always known, the future of slavery, not states' rights, was the real cause of the war, and the end of slavery, commemorated by the celebration of Juneteenth, was the war's most important outcome. As Du Bois once wrote, the arrival of troops and agents working for the post-war Freedmen's Bureau, quote, set going a system of free labor, established a beginning of peasant proprietorship, secured the recognition of black freedmen before courts of law, and founded the free common school in the South. Such was the dawn of freedom, Du Bois concluded. Such was the work of the Freedmen's Bureau. And such was the real meaning of Juneteenth to a woman like Henrietta Wood. When Gordon Granger and Union troops finally arrived in Texas, they brought emancipation for the second time in her life, and another taste of liberty. On the other hand, while Wood's story makes clear why we celebrate Juneteenth, it also reveals a few things we shouldn't forget, even as we remember it. As it's usually told, the story of Juneteenth is the story of how enslaved Texans were freed for the first time or learned of their emancipation. But remember that Wood had experienced freedom before and already knew what it meant. For her, and probably for some others in Texas in 1865, Juneteenth was not the first coming of freedom, but the second. And the other thing we need to remember is that Juneteenth didn't bring freedom right away to everyone in Texas. The few months after Juneteenth saw the arrival of the first Freedmen's Bureau agents, a rapid buildup of troops inside the state, eventually peaking at around 50,000 men. And as soldiers began to venture out from command posts in Houston or Hempstead, soldiers did begin to inform any slaves they met who had not heard about the Confederate defeat. But most of the cotton counties in Texas never saw a federal troop until well after Confederate surrender. Confederate Texas proved especially hard to occupy and subdue, even after Juneteenth. Some white planters in Texas were abducting freed people and attempting to take them to Cuba or Brazil, where slavery was still legal. Others were using violence to make freed people stay put. As one Freedmen's Bureau agent reported from Houston in November 1865, committees have been established in some counties to prevent the freedmen from going to their homes in other states by any means necessary. One formerly enslaved woman in northeastern Texas later remembered the sight of black people's bodies hanging from trees beside the Sabine River right after freedom, as she said. White vigilantes left the corpses there as warnings to other ex-slaves who might try to leave. In other words, even as freedom was arriving, black Texans had to contend with a white terrorist campaign that sought for decades to stop or reverse emancipation. Black Texans fought back, but eventually white Americans in the North retreated from enforcing the promises of Reconstruction, dooming black Southerners to fight white supremacy largely on their own for a time. The premature departure of the Freedmen's Bureau from the South started the sequence of events that led to the Black Codes, lynching, Jim Crow, and a system of incarceration and convict leasing that some historians have referred to as slavery by another name. As W.E.B. Du Bois put it in his historical masterwork, Black Reconstruction in America, published in 1935, quote, "The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again toward slavery." Or, to paraphrase Du Bois's contemporary Zora Neale Hurston, when it comes to the story of the Civil War and Reconstruction in Texas, dawn and doom was in the branches. That was certainly the moment of emancipation as Henrietta Wood experienced it, a moment of dawn and doom all tangled up together. Remember that when we left off her story, she had been forced to march some 400 miles from Natchez, Mississippi to Robertson County, Texas, where Brandon rented a cotton plantation near Hearne. That meant that for the rest of the war and for all of 1865, Wood remained in an area very remote from the U.S. Army's operations. Now, just before the new year, 1866, a Freedmen's Bureau agent did finally appear in Robertson County in the form of William H. Farner. But Farner only won the job by lying to superiors about his past and representing himself as an Iowa Republican. In fact, Farner had served as a Confederate surgeon during the Civil War, and in 1863 he had even moved 20 slaves from Louisiana to Brazos County, Texas himself. Farner was hardly the man most likely to hold other refugee planters to account. Before long, his superiors were hearing reports of Farner's neglect of orders, abuse of whiskey, and brutal application of the Bureau's instructions to make the freedmen work. He reportedly punished freed people who violated the terms of their labor contracts by suspending them from their thumbs for long periods of time. By May 1866, Farner had been replaced in Robertson County as the agent for the area. But his successor, Champ Carter Jr., was not much better. Carter was a Robertson County local who disobeyed instructions from headquarters and protested that physical punishment, as he said, or the fear of it, was the only way to control what he called the fickle nature of stupid, ignorant, freed people. No wonder that on June 17, 1866, almost exactly one whole year after Juneteenth, Gerard Brandon wrote to his new son-in-law that, quote, "Most of my freedmen are determined to leave Texas at the end of this season." They had seen enough to know that freedom, wherever it was not to be found in Texas. And that remained true for decades after emancipation. The recent discovery of the Sugarland 95, the 95 victims of the convict leasing system here in Texas, is a reminder that for some Texans, freedom only brought a new kind of bondage. As for Henrietta Wood, however, she still remembered a different place and a different kind of liberty, the freedom she had tasted in Cincinnati before her kidnapping in 1853. And eventually, as I explain in more detail in my book about her story, Wood managed to escape Brandon's clutches in Texas and Mississippi, and she returned all the way back to Cincinnati, Ohio by 1869. And that's where Henrietta Wood's story took its most surprising turn. In 1870, with the help of a lawyer living in Covington, Kentucky, she determined the whereabouts of Zebulon Ward, the man who had kidnapped and re-enslaved her 17 years before. Now, by then, Ward was a wealthy and well-connected man. He had made his fortune as a keeper of state penitentiaries in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Arkansas. He was a pioneer of the convict leasing system that reduced many black prisoners in the post-war South, including here in Texas, to a new kind of bondage. And when he died in 1894, Zebulon Ward passed on an estate worth some $600,000 to his family, making him a multimillionaire in today's terms. But Wood did something that few formerly enslaved people had the opportunity to try. She filed a lawsuit for reparations against Zebulon Ward, demanding $20,000 in damages for what he had done, including for the years of wages she had lost while laboring for Brandon in Mississippi and here in Texas. Then, in 1878, after 8 long years of litigation, a federal court in Ohio finally handed down a verdict in the case of Wood v. Ward. And here's the truly amazing thing. She won. A jury of all white men decided in Henrietta Wood's favor, ruling against Zebulon Ward. Now, they awarded her only $2,500. It was only a fraction of the $20,000 she had asked. Certainly an even smaller fraction than what a man like Zebulon Ward could have afforded to pay. But it remains the largest known sum of restitution ever awarded by a U.S. court to a formerly enslaved person. Now, that verdict was an extraordinary feat, and one of the first things that I ever learned about the story of Henrietta Wood. It's what launched me on the research that led to the writing of my book. And I still find it as inspiring today as I did when I first learned about it in 2014. Here was a woman who survived slavery twice, living in bondage in Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas, and then managed to return to the scene of the crime of her kidnapping and make a powerful white man pay. In doing so, she also made a powerful argument that most white Americans at the time were very reluctant to hear. Her argument, in brief, was that freedom from slavery, Juneteenth in short, was not by itself enough to repair all of the doom of enslavement. She made clear that a full dawn of freedom required reparation as well. Now, that argument did not die with Wood, who lived until 1912. Few formerly enslaved people ever won even the modest amount of restitution that Wood claimed. And that led other advocates of reparations, like Callie House and Queen Mother Moore, to later advocate a more systematic reckoning with slavery and the injustices that followed. In recent years, our own Texas Congresswoman, Sheila Jackson Lee, has taken up their mantle by sponsoring H.R. 40, a bill that calls for a national commission to be established to investigate the effects of slavery and its aftermath and to make recommendations about reparations, much like the commission that crafted the bill for reparations for victims of Japanese American internment camps that was signed by President Ronald Reagan. H.R. 40 has been introduced in Congress in every session since the 1980s, but it wasn't until 2019, on Juneteenth appropriately, that Representative Jackson Lee chaired the first ever congressional hearings about the bill. The hearings proved to be contentious and, not surprisingly, given the era we live in, highly partisan in tone. But I suspect that the issue of reparations will continue to come up in the coming months and years. And when they do, there are a few lessons that this hidden history of Henrietta Wood can offer us. For one thing, her experience in Texas is a needed reminder of the great lengths to which slaveholders went to maintain their control over enslaved people, even after emancipation. It's one reason why the arrival of freedom alone did not resolve all of the damage that slavery had done. And perhaps even more importantly, the end of Wood's story offers an important lesson about the differences that even a small amount of restitution could make for a formerly enslaved woman and her family. After her victory, Henrietta moved from Cincinnati to Chicago, where her son, a man named Arthur H. Sims, used some of the money from her case against Ward to purchase a house in Hyde Park. That house proved to be a fruitful asset for Wood and for Sims, particularly as a means of acquiring cash and lines of credit. Using his equity in the real estate he had bought, Sims decided to attend law school. And in 1889, he became one of the first African American graduates of what became Northwestern University's School of Law. Sims would live in Chicago until his death in 1951, practicing law and presiding over a large clan that included grandchildren and many great-grandchildren. His descendants included one grandson trained as a Tuskegee Airman during World War II, a jazz musician in post-war Chicago, and a host of African American professionals, including a librarian, a doctor, and a computer systems engineer. Here he is, pictured with one of his great-grandchildren, possibly poring over a law book in a photograph taken only a few years before his death. As far as I know, no photograph of Henrietta Wood still exists. But this photo serves for me as a poignant image of what she managed to achieve through her determined fight for justice, and of the new dawn of freedom that eventually came after so many dooms. Thank you.